Good morning, everyone. Today we're going to start Chapter 12, the Civil Rights Movement, 1954 to 1968. This is Part 1, the demand for civil rights. Now, before and during World War II, African Americans were not treated equally by a large part of the American society. Now, when the war is over, many African Americans fought in our military in Europe and the Pacific, and they start coming home. And people started to feel that maybe it was time for everyone to be treated equally. Now, President Truman decided it was a time to give equal opportunities to all Americans. And he pushed for civil rights like anti-lynching laws. It's kind of strange to think that you actually had to write laws to make lynching illegal. But now, Truman, as I mentioned in the last section, grew up in the South. Now, it wasn't the deep South like Alabama, Mississippi, Louisiana. It was Missouri. Missouri was a slave state before the Civil War, but never really seceded. But anyway, he decided to put any of these prejudices he had aside to ensure equal opportunity for everyone. Now, Congress, having many Southern, congressmen there, did not act on his civil rights. So Truman did. He ended segregation in the military. You remember we discussed the last section, Executive Order 9981, which now allowed, of course, blacks and whites to fight together just in time for the Korean War. Jackie Robinson. No discussion about ending segregation can happen without talking about Jackie Robinson. So we're going to start out with a little lighter part. Now, since, remember we mentioned this earlier in the year, since the 19th century, Major League Baseball was segregated. It was for white players only. Black players were not allowed to play in the league. There was no actual rule. You couldn't go to like page 13, rule number 46, saying blacks could not play. But it was something that none of the owners, signed black baseball players. So this is kind of this unwritten law. So black players can't play. Now, what they do is they create the Negro Leagues, and they had many star black athletes. The Negro Leagues played in major league stadiums when the other team was away. So when the St. Louis Cardinals were home, they were on the road. And when the St. Louis Cardinals were on the road playing someone else, then the the black Negro League teams would play in their stadiums to their fans. They had many teams. Probably the most famous is the one you see here, the Homestead Grays. Their 1931 team was considered one of the best teams in baseball, white or black. And the Negro Leagues had a lot of great players, all right? We see Buck Leonard, great first baseman. Cool Papa Bell, who stole bases. They joked about him is that he could turn out the light switch and be in bed before the room got dark. Josh Gibson, big home run hitter. They compared him to Babe Ruth. They actually called him the Black Babe Ruth. Really nice story I heard is when Babe Ruth heard that, he said, well, maybe I'm the white Josh Gibson. We have Rube Foster, these were all great players. Oscar Charleston. But they were never allowed to play in Major League Baseball. Now, of course, later, a lot of them have been honored. We see stamps were issued to honor the Negro Leagues, statues. I took this picture out in St. Louis in front of Busch Stadium, Cool Papa Bell, who played in St. Louis. So they put a statue to him along with some of the famous St. Louis Cardinals. They actually have a Negro League Baseball Museum. It's in Kansas City. I was there a couple of years ago. I didn't even know about it. Next time I go there, I got to go see it. But there was even a Major League Baseball museum for the Negro Leagues. And of course, the Major League Baseball did eventually in the 1970s started inducting Negro League players into the Baseball Hall of Fame. Or in fact, right now, I believe there's like 60 players from the Negro Leagues who are in the Major League Baseball Hall of Fame in Cooperstown. So that's a good thing. At least now they're recognizing the contributions these men gave to baseball. Now, in 1946, Branch Rickey, he was the general manager of the Brooklyn Dodgers. Now, these are the Los Angeles Dodgers, but they play in Brooklyn. They played in Brooklyn first in the up until the 1950s when they moved to California. So Branch Rickey decided to challenge this so-called color line. So he signs Jackie Robinson to a major league contract. Now, this is, of course, going to make everyone really upset. The other baseball people coming, but there is really no rule. The owners all start screaming. The commissioner says, yeah, but there's no rule against it. So he starts out playing for a team in Montreal, a minor league team. One of his first professional games, you probably all heard, was in Roosevelt Stadium here in Jersey City. It's not there anymore. Remember, we talked about that. It was torn down. But that's why you see a statue to Jackie Robinson outside the Journal Square Path Station. So anyway, in 1947, Robinson plays for the Dodgers. He suffered abuse and insults around the league. If you ever see the movie 42, it's an excellent movie, and it talks about you can see all the abuse he suffered that first year. But he's a good player. He actually wins the first ever Rookie of the Year. And in 1949, 2 years later, he's voted the league MVP. So obviously he's a very good player. Now, after Robinson, other teams rushed to sign black baseball players. The Dodgers had opened the door, and now other teams are going to kind of jump in, and they all start signing players. The Dodgers signed another one, Roy Campanella, a catcher. In fact, you can see him here in that other picture where Jackie Robinson's holding up the plaque. You can see just to his right, you see a catcher there. That's Roy Campanella. He was another black player who was signed, all these young players out of the Negro Leagues. But there was actually one negative. If they could say there would be, how could there be anything negative? There was one small negative thing about signing all these black players. It pretty much ended the Negro Leagues themselves. And a lot of the older players who were just too old to be signed were out of baseball. So I know it's a very minor thing, but it did end the Negro Leagues. Now, other sports, after what happens in baseball, other sports rush to integrate. The first one was football. Now, let me just get this here. In 1946, the Los Angeles Rams signed Kenny Washington and Woody Strode. Washington was really good. Washington is, here, let me put here. Here is, this is Kenny Washington here, and Woody Strode over here. This man never played professional football. You may not recognize him with a helmet on, number 28 there, but he was the one who wanted to play professional baseball. That's Jackie Robinson. This is the University of, this is UCLA, University of California at Los Angeles. What was their nickname? The Bruins, Deb? UCLA?
Yeah, the Bruins at UCLA.
Yeah, these are the UCLA Bruins college football team. I think this was like 1945. So there's Woody Strode, Kenny Washington, and Jackie Robinson. They didn't really have great long careers. In fact, Woody Strode here actually went on to become a great movie star. He was in a lot of movies. This is one of his most famous one where he plays a gladiator along with Kirk Douglas in the famous movie Spartacus, the epic movie. So you see Woody Strode there, and he went on and played in a lot of other movies. In 1950, 21-year-old Earl Lloyd became the first African-American to play in the NBA. He played for a number of years. He never had a great career, but later on he got traded to the Detroit Pistons and he became a scout. And as a scout, he helped Detroit sign future Hall of Fame greats Earl Monroe, known as Earl the Pearl, and Willis Reed, both of them would go on and have great careers with the New York Knicks, back when the Knicks were really good. Sorry, if you're any Knicks fans out there, sorry. Now, hockey takes longer. In fact, it was in 1958, 12 years after Jackie Robinson broke the color line in baseball, before Willie O'Ree broke the color line in hockey when he signed with the Boston Bruins. Part of the problem there is because it wasn't because he was black. You also have to be black and Canadian. Back in the 1950s, almost everyone in the NHL was a Canadian, and they don't have a very high black population in Canada. So you had to get a black Canadian to actually break into the NHL. But he does. He goes on to, today he's actually considered a ambassador to the sport and does a lot to help with minorities, playing the sport of hockey. Here we, in one of these ceremonial puck drops in Boston Gardens. All right, now we're going to talk about Brown v. Board of Education. It is probably the greatest, among the top greatest landmark decisions in the Supreme Court. And the greatest victory in the struggle to gain civil rights was in the courts. Now, schools had been segregated since 1886. Remember we discussed Plessy v. Ferguson that came out that year that basically said that schools can be separate as long as they're equal. All right? They weren't equal, but this is something we're going to be talking about. And a lot of people did not want to see, as you can see, these kids here holding up signs saying they don't want to go to school with black children. So this is going to be a major issue. Now, in 1951, Oliver Brown sued the Topeka Board of Education, that's in Topeka, Kansas, the Topeka Board of Education to allow his 8-year-old daughter to attend a white public school. Now, the case is going to go all the way up to the Supreme Court. Future African-American Supreme Court Justice Thurgood Marshall was Brown's lawyer. There he is on the right. He'll eventually become the first black man to be named to the Supreme Court, but that's going to be much, much later. Now, the Supreme Court decides to vote to end segregation in schools, all right? We have these 9 old white guys up there, and one of the greatest surprises, all 9 voted to end segregation. It was unanimous, 9-0 vote. The court said separate facilities are inherently unequal. Eisenhower disagreed with it, not because he was against blacks getting an education. He was afraid this was going to cause a major problems in the country. He was right, it was. Eisenhower liked things to be nice and calm. But he said, Supreme Court does it, he will enforce the ruling. That's what presidents do. Now, segregation is now history. In theory, not yet in practice. Part of the problems is that the Supreme Court makes the ruling. What if these southern states decide not to follow the ruling, which is what's going to happen? Now we're going to talk about the start of the civil rights movement. Now the civil rights movement has been around, obviously, since the end of the Civil War, and there's, law cases, we've talked about it before, but it doesn't really pick up until this terrible tragedy occurs in 1955. A young 14-year-old African-American boy named Emmett Till was lynched in Mississippi. He was accused of whistling at a white woman. He was in a store, supposedly this woman who worked in a store, he supposedly whistled at her. Well, her husband and her husband's, I think it was his brother or uncle or someone or cousin, decided that night to get back. They dragged him out of his uncle's house where he was staying. They beat him, they shot him, and then they threw his body in the river. He was recovered 3 days later, but it was a terrible tragedy. Now the men were arrested and they were put on trial. It was an all-white jury that very quickly came back and found him not guilty. They actually later confessed to doing it to a newspaper or magazine because you can't be tried for the same crime twice. It's one of our constitutional things. So they got away with it. Now, the brutality of the murder and the fact that his killers were acquitted angered many people in this country and really started the civil rights movement. I mean, it'd been there, but now it's being kicked into high gear. Many people. Now, one of the things that really pushed it is Emmett Till's mother decided to display Emmett in an open coffin. And it was terrible if you could see the way he was beat up and abused, physically. And it really shocked people. It really shocked people like Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King looked at this and realized that we got to stop this. So this murder is what really starts the whole civil rights movement. Now we're going to talk about the Montgomery Bus Boycott. Now, segregation laws, these what we call Jim Crow laws, we discussed those back when we talked about Reconstruction, the idea of separate but equal, remained on buses throughout the South. Blacks had to sit at the back of the bus. And it was not like where they could just walk on the bus and then walk to the back. It was actually even worse. They had, how you get onto the bus and you pay the bus driver. They did that, then they had to get off the bus, walk to the back door, and then enter the bus through the back door. So it was very demeaning to them. So they were frequently ordered to surrender the seats. If a white person, even though black passengers made up 75% of the riders in Montgomery, Alabama, white people wanted a seat, the blacks had to give them up. In 1955, Rosa Parks is arrested. She decides not to give up her seat on a bus in Montgomery, Alabama. This is the actual bus. It's in a museum in outside Detroit, Michigan, the Ford Museum. They have a lot of really cool stuff. I really want to go there someday. But this is the actual bus. Now, on the bus, there's a statue of Rosa Parks showing the seat that she actually sat in. This is the actual spot where it was the bus stop. My wife and I were here in Montgomery a couple years ago, so they have a plaque there. Now I hear there's even more there now, and right to the behind me where I'm taking the pictures is actually the Rosa Parks Museum. Unfortunately, it was closed that day, but this is the actual bus stop where she was arrested. Now, Parks is arrested and charged with violating segregation laws. Here's the New York Times showing a picture of her being fingerprinted. She was found guilty and fined $10 plus court cost of $4. Of course, that's a lot more in today's money. So after the arrest of Rosa Parks, civil rights leaders organized a boycott of city buses. A boycott is an economic protest. I'm going to show you a little short documentary on it, but it really was, they refused to ride buses, and they did make up 75% of the ridership, so this is going to be an economic protest. It works very well as long as everyone gets involved in it, and everyone did. Some of these people walked miles to work, so it becomes very, very big. Now I'm going to show you this thing here. This is on the protest.
In Montgomery, Alabama, people looked at how they were being impacted negatively by their society, and they assumed responsibility for change.
Joanne Robinson was an English professor at Alabama State University, and she headed up an organization called the Women's Political Council. Joanne Robinson had an episode on the Montgomery bus where she is accosted by a bus driver. She leaves the bus, in terror. She thought the bus driver was going to hit her as he demanded she sit in the black-only section in an almost empty bus. When she talked to other women in the Women's Political Council about this episode, she found out that they had similar experiences. There were a number of arrests in 1955 of black women who were violating the segregation ordinance on the buses. And on the night of December 1st, when Rosa Parks is arrested, Joanne Robinson springs into action, and they actually execute this plan to initiate a bus boycott.
At the time, most people rode the bus to kind of get around. There weren't as many cars on the road. So you begin to realize that if we don't ride the buses, we are able to kind of break the system to a great degree.
Joanne Robinson comes on campus late that night with a couple of students, runs off 50,000 flyers. The next morning, between classes, they pass out these flyers. She calls a civil rights attorney, Fred Gray. She calls E.D. Nixon, labor organizer, really the recognized leader of Black Montgomery. And they decide to endorse the boycott. They organize the Montgomery Improvement Association to execute and to coordinate the activities surrounding the Montgomery Bus Boycott. And they select this newcomer, Martin Luther King, to head up the Montgomery Improvement Association. Martin Luther King weaves into Montgomery ideas about love and civil disobedience, overcoming adversity.
And the people of Montgomery were willing not only to listen, but to act on this. I was the NAACP Youth Council president, and I participated in the boycott. I walked to school, and we just saw the empty buses go by because there were no black people on them.
At the time that this movement began here, we had about 50,000 African Americans living in Montgomery, and there were pretty close to 50,000 black people who worked together during this bus boycott.
We stayed off the buses and found other ways to get to where we needed to go. And so they bought station wagons. And they had an actual route, just like buses have routes.
For several weeks, I was a volunteer driver every day, going out and just hauling people to work or to school.
So people just didn't walk. They rode, but they rode in a system that they created. 382 days. That's a long time. Can you imagine how empowered people felt? It's like, we did what?
The Montgomery Bus Boycott says to the nation that segregation is no longer the law of the land, and that the formula for attacking segregation in all of its facets is going to be nonviolent civil disobedience on one hand and litigation on the other.
The boycott was one of the greatest examples of civic engagement of the 20th century.
Young people.
All right. So that was the thing on the Montgomery bus boycott. Now, they mentioned in the video that Martin Luther King Jr., who was a Baptist minister, became a leader. He would give out speeches, and here's one of his famous quotes. There comes a time when people get tired of being segregated and humiliated, tired of being kicked about by the brutal feet of oppression. Now, King and 89 other boycott leaders were indicted for conspiring to interfere with a business, the buses. King actually spent 2 weeks in the Montgomery jail. And the Montgomery bus boycott lasted 381 days. That's a long time not to be walking to work. Finally, in 1956, the Supreme Court ruled that segregation on public buses and transportation was against the law. So that pretty much ended. The bus boycott was just winding down because the buses were just losing too much money. So they started to agree to allow people to sit where they wanted to sit. And then the Supreme Court kind of backed the whole thing up. So anyway, moving on. All right, the last thing we're going to talk about today is Little Rock, Arkansas. Now, we've said that segregation is now over in schools. But the question is, and we mentioned this earlier, would it be enforced? Now, Brown v. Board of Education and the Montgomery bus protest caused many Southern whites to react with fear and anger. And these whites started to fight back. The worst confrontation was in Little Rock. Now, in September of 1957, 9 black students wanted to enroll in the all-white Little Rock High School that you see here. This is more of a modern picture. Now, the Arkansas governor used the National Guard, which is under his control, to block the 9 black students from enrolling in Little Rock High School. Governor Orville Faubus brought the National Guard out to support all the segregationists there. You see them waving their Confederate flags. And the Guard was there to keep the students, you can see the students in this picture, enrolling. This picture actually made a lot of magazines. Just shows, you can see this young black freshman girl walking toward the high school, and you can just see with all the white people around him yelling terrible things at him. That woman behind him is like enraged. And it really just shows you how much tension was there. Now, the sight of soldiers blocking the high school students polarized the nation. people in the North saw this and said, what is going on down in the South? President Eisenhower had to step in. So the first thing he does is, excuse me, he places the National Guard under federal control and used the military to enforce the law. So basically, by federalizing the National Guard, they were now under the control no longer of the governor, but now they're under control of President Eisenhower. Excuse me. And he also sends in the 101st Airborne to Little Rock. These were soldiers. The 101st Airborne was famous band of brothers. They had, jumped in Normandy. Were at the Battle of Bastogne during the Battle of the Bulge. So this is now, we're bringing in a high-powered, military unit. Now, Faubus tried to keep the school segregated. He actually put out a ballot for all the parents to vote saying, well, I'm told I have to open it or else I just close the whole schools down. He was looking for an out, to get around it. But to his shock and to a lot of people's shock, the parents of the white students voted to close the high school rather than allow the black students to enroll. This is like totally shocking. It became known as the lost year as the school remained closed for the entire year. It's kind of like what we're doing now without any online teaching. It just was closed. Nobody went to school. They had to repeat, obviously, the following year. No sports. It was just, nobody went to school for a whole year. 44 teachers were actually fired because they supported ending segregation. They were later rehired, but there was a lot of people in the South who really wanted to end it. Now, they have a monument in Little Rock. This is right out of the side the State House. It's called the Little Rock Nine. It's a statue to the 9 students. I took this picture when we were down there a couple years ago. All right, one last thing I want to cover because it kind of has a connection to Little Rock. A couple years later in 1960, New Orleans was forced to desegregate 2 schools. Now, today we think of New Orleans as, Mardi Gras and a lot of parties and celebrations, but it was 50, 60 years ago a southern city with segregation. Now, after they were forced to desegregate the 2 schools, there were riots, there were death threats to students. Now, one of the students was a 6-year-old named Ruby Bridges, and she's going to become the first student to attend an all-white school. Now, obviously, she's not going to be able to just walk in the front door. They actually had federal marshals escort her into the school while white parents were chanting segregation forever. There you see her in her little white sweater. And this photograph here showing these federal marshals marching around her to protect her actually became the subject of a famous painting by American painter Norman Rockwell. You see a picture here like of Ruby Bridges marching with these men there protecting her. And it kind of shows you how outrageous this, what was going on in the South, But this is not going to end. And as much as right now we're doing protests and boycotts, things in the next section you're going to see are going to get really ugly. All right? Violence and bloodshed. But now the situation calmed down during the year when people realized it was really making them in New Orleans look bad. And it would take 10 years, up to 1970, before New Orleans schools became fully integrated. Well, that's it. I hope you enjoyed it. Hope you got something out of this and learned something. The next section we're going to be talking about is section 2, how it starts to intensify. But anyway, that's it for today. Enjoy yourself. Have a good day. Talk to you tomorrow. Bye-bye.